Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 2024 Budget and Grid Management Charge Process Initial Stakeholder Meeting. My name is Brenda Corona, representing in behalf of the Stakeholder Affairs Group at the California ISO. I welcome you to this afternoon where we will be discussing a lot of topics for this initiative or this process. For today's meeting, we have a few housekeeping reminders as this call is being recorded for informational and conveniences purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. As these are collaborative group discussion, we will be allowing a lot of people to ask questions, and we also are accepting any professional and respectful brief comments, and we also going to be having a commenting template sharing later on. As for the instructions for today's meeting, we would like to let everyone know that we're utilizing the raise hand icon that's located in the middle lower bar. This icon will be used and you will be entering a queue. Make sure when you are on the queue and you're unmuted, make sure don't mute yourself because it will lock you. This will prevent us from unmuting you, so make sure you keep that hand raised until you're unmuted and make sure to state your name and affiliation when speaking. At this time, we will go ahead and do a few remarks about Michelle is our event producer for today, and she will help us with any questions. Feel free to submit any questions through chat, but other than that, we will go ahead and kickstart this call. And for this agenda, I will go ahead and introduce April Gordon for the GMC revenue requirement and rate processes, and then we'll go on to Lisa Johnson for the managing employee composition. And we will have a project release plans from Ken Kasparian. We'll have project summaries from Jan, and then we'll have financial summaries from Dennis. And then lastly, we will have calendar next steps by Thomas. And then we will go ahead and do a little bit of a recap and feedback and discussion. And last two slides will be about stakeholder affairs and other important news. But other than that, we'll go ahead and introduce Ryan, who's in the room for April Gordon's line. So let's go ahead and get you connected. I do see you guys unmuted, and so now you can go ahead.
Well, thanks everyone, and welcome to this meeting. This is the annual kind of kickoff meeting for our budget process, the development of the budget for next year. You can see from the agenda we've got a variety of subject matter experts here to kind of walk through budget principles, kind of a refresher of the process that we'll go through over the next several months, as well as kind of cover some of the key spend items with employee compensation, capital, et cetera. I'll encourage all the presenters to kind of pause during their presentations to ask questions throughout, and then at the end we can kind of have that final discussion. But with that, I'll turn it over to April.
All right, thank you, Brian. Okay, hi everyone. Good afternoon. I'll go ahead and take you through the first steps of this presentation by going over the timeline for the GMC revenue requirement. This process is from August through December. We're at the initial stakeholder meeting point. After this, we'll go into the internal development process where we will use the feedback from this meeting along with the feedback from the rest of our budget owners throughout the organization to develop not only our O&M budget, but then the broader GMC revenue requirement budget, which will turn into the rates once we've completed the budget process. We'll go ahead and post a preliminary draft of the revenue requirement on October 31st. And then we'll go ahead and have a follow-up stakeholder meeting we'll have a follow-up stakeholder meeting on October 31st to go over the draft that was released. Then we'll present the draft to the board for their review and comments. We'll have a follow-up board opportunity and stakeholder opportunity in December, and then we'll post the rates going into 2024 at the very end of December. Next slide, please. Yeah.
Sorry, I want to break in for April for just a minute. I typically use this meeting to kind of at least share with you any significant items that we are seeing as, that will impact the budget for the next year. At this point, we don't see anything major changing for next year. If any of you participated in the cost of service study stakeholder call that happened a few weeks ago, we did state at that point that we do feel we are committed to building a revenue requirement that will still be within the revenue requirement cap that's in the tariff of $202 million. It's going to be close. We're going to be very close to that number this year. But other than that, I don't see any major changes in year-over-year revenue requirement between this year and next year. Just some mild inflationary increases getting us very close to that cap. So back to you, April.
All right, thanks. Next slide, please. All right, our GMC revenue requirement is it's composed of 5 different elements. The O&M budget is by far the largest component, and this is where we hold the budgets for our personnel and non-personnel items. And to give you an idea of how much the ratio is, we're looking at about 77% of that budget going towards personnel items, and the remainder being used for items such as telecommunications, training, office meetings, legal expenses, et cetera. We'll go ahead and have Lisa Johnson go over more of the budgeting around the personnel expenses in the next section of the presentation. The next element is the debt service, and that is a fixed item. And that was the service that was taken out to fund our Folsom headquarters. The next item is our cash funded capital, and that's what we use to fund our projects throughout the year. So the first 3 components represent our needs as an organization in order to fund the services that we provide. The next 2 elements are offsets to those revenue requirements or components. Other costs and revenues consist of WEIM administrative charges, as well as RC services, as well as interest earnings and the California-Oregon Intertie, and the generator interconnection projects funding. Those act as an offset to our costs. The next component is our operating cost reserve adjustment. Now that is an element of the revenue requirement that essentially makes us whole with our stakeholders. And what I mean by that is any operating year in which we over-collect in our revenues or underspend in our expenses, or vice versa, that amount goes back to the stakeholders in the following year's revenue requirement. I'm happy to say that we have only offered credits in this category in our revenue requirement since the operations began. All 5 components are equal to the revenue requirement going into the following year. Now, to come up with the rates of what we are going to charge, we take a look at the service category percentages per the cost of service study. And just to give you a sense of when that is, we're actually in the middle of the cost of service study this year. That was the meeting that Ryan was referring to earlier. Now, the cost of service study gives us a sense of how much of a revenue requirement needs to go to fund operations such as market services, system operations, CRR services, and reliability coordinator services. And then to a further extent, how much we need to fund for our WEIM services as well. We take those broken out amounts, we divide them by the projected volumes in each of those categories to come up with the rates that we would charge per megawatt hour going into the following year. Next slide, please. This slide goes over the budgeting principles that the California ISO holds dear and follows each year. Our principles align with our strategic plan. We also maintain fiscal discipline throughout, not only throughout the year, but in the long term as well. We encourage collaboration on the budget development, not only with our stakeholders, but with our internal budget owners as well. The process allows for transparency to be throughout the process, and we remain underneath our revenue requirement cap. Currently, our cap for 2023 or 2024 is $202 million. Next slide, please. Now, in speaking about our strategic plan, our vision is to operate the world's most reliable and cost-effective environmentally sustainable power system. I know that that's a mouthful, but basically our five elements of that strategic plan include reliably and efficiently integrating new resources and proactively upgrading operational capabilities, strengthen resource adequacy and meet California Senate Bill 100 goals through long-term transmission planning and effective coordination with state agencies, build on the foundation of the Western Energy Imbalance Market to further expand Western market opportunities, provide highly responsive and inclusive stakeholder engagement and customer service, and finally, create a flexible and adaptive work environment that retains and attracts a highly skilled and engaged workforce. With that, that's a good segue to take a pause and then hand it over to Lisa to talk about how we retain those and attract those employees. If there are any questions, please raise your hand.
There are no questions in queue.
Great, thank you, Michelle. I'll hand it over to Lisa to take us to the next section. Next slide, please.
Good afternoon. I'm Lisa Johnson, and I'm going to talk about managing our employee compensation. Please move to the next slide. So the managing of our employee compensation supports our current ISO philosophy to attract, train, motivate, and retain top talent. To ensure that our pay is competitive, we use market pay practices that include biannual salary surveys, which we match 100% of our ISO positions. In addition to that, we have what's called a pay for performance philosophy, which includes setting high performance goals that are aligned to our corporate objectives. And those corporate objectives are reviewed and approved by the board, and those objectives are cascaded down to each individual employee. At the end of the year, the performance results are viewed against those objectives, and we do differentiate our merit pay based on the performance and achievement of those objectives. We do have a strong performance management program that includes several components. One is the individual performance plans made up of our core job responsibilities, as well as the objectives that include stretch objectives. And then our management team year-long provides feedback to our employees, coaching and supporting them to achieve those objectives. We do have an annual budgeted merit and promotional pool in which we optimize the utilization of those salary dollars by basing the merit increases on performance. So this is, in general, our program. I don't know if anyone has any questions.
There are currently no questions in queue.
Okay, thank you. Then I will turn it over to Ken.
April, we lost your audio. I will see if we can get you back again. At this time, let's wait 1 second to everyone. Hi, Michelle, can we double check the audio for April? Hi,
Your line has been unmuted.
Hey, Brenda, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Thanks for checking. Yeah, we lost you for a second.
Yep, sorry about that. Had a technical glitch. So, hello everyone, this is Ken Kasparian with the Enterprise Program Management Office to talk about the project release plans. So I always want to start out with showing you where to get the most recent information, because as always, these are snapshots in time, and as you'll see in the RUG forum, things are already changing. So want to make sure that you know to reach out to our release planning page, and where you can find the release schedule, the implementation milestones, and here's when these are updated. So please track or keep these links for ongoing information. Next slide, please. The other area is make sure that you're plugged into these forums. So we've got our market performance and planning forum and our release user group. If you leverage the link here, it'll bring you to the main sites where you can see the calendars and get connected in with those groups. Next slide, please. So one of the big differences you'll see this year, and April started to allude to it with our strategic plan, is we're organizing our projects by portfolios that are aligned to that strategic plan. So we have just a quick snapshot of the different portfolios and what they tie into. So as you see the list that are going to be posted of our active projects and really our potential projects, you'll start to see them grouped by these portfolios. Next slide, please. Okay, for 2023, there's some projects that are still going for the fall and independent. And if you look at the release users group that's happening today, you'll see a few slight changes to these slides, but basically these are the projects that are active in flight for this year. There's a hybrid resources 2C that you'll see on the new slides, a little bit of more granularity on that. And then a few things that are moving around. We're in a big planning period right now as part of the capital planning for next year and assessing resources and what we can complete this year as we move into next year. So these will continue to be fine-tuned over the next few months. Next slide, please. For 2024, we've got some independent pre-summer projects. We don't have any new EIM entities coming on board in the spring of 2024, so those are basically going to be independent pre-summer coming out, and then we've got our fall 2024 and spring 2025. We've grouped those because of the day-ahead and EDAM implementations. The goal is to have the majority of the implementation done by fall, but it won't actually go live for onboarding until spring. So that way, between fall and spring, we're finishing up readiness and final testing for spring of 2025 go live. And the next slide shows what's in 2025 and beyond. So you'll recognize things from our policy roadmap and other items in here. Before I pass it on to Jan Cogdill, I wanted to see if there was any questions.
Ken, this is Brenda.
Hi, Brenda.
So I did want to add on to this because I'm helping out with the price formation enhancement initiative. Just want to give everyone a heads up during the working group process we have going on from now to October. We're welcoming all stakeholders to participate in these working group sessions during the proposal development phase. So we are having that kickoff. We had a kickoff last week, and we're going to go every week for 2 hours. So just want to give everyone a heads up on this call that we are encouraging any comments and also any discussion with those working groups that are on the ISO calendar. Thanks.
Thank you, Brenda. Are there any other questions from the participants?
Currently no questions on the line.
Okay, thank you. Hand it over to Jan.
Hi, I'm Jan Cogdill. I'm with the Financial Planning Department, and I deal with the capital budget that we have every year. And as we have done in the past, we have posted 3 lists for you. Our active project, currently active projects as of the end of June, all projects that were completed in the last year. And then the final one is the list of potential projects. Next slide, please. So going forward in 2023, we had an approved budget of $25 million. Prior year, it was a $20 million budget. So this year, we anticipated some fairly large projects coming forward. The 2024 budget, we're targeting between $22 million to $25 million. At this point, that's just a target. We're waiting to see some of the forecasts that are going to come out of this portfolio management process by the strategic initiatives, and of course, obviously, EDAM and Day Ahead are big projects on the horizon for the next year. You might notice that there is a definite difference in the proposed project list for this year. It's only 33 items. Previously, and in quite a few years past, it's been about 75 items. So given this new portfolio process that we're going through, we've actually gone through and said, you know, these projects just aren't going to get done here in the next couple of years. So looking out the horizon, trying to do a true road mapping of our projects, it has definitely changed our outlook on what really can be done. And rather than just listing all kinds of projects that really are wish lists, we're kind of refining that. So we'll see that even pare down some more as we see the final lists coming out in our October meeting and the final list for December. And those will be broken out into the strategic initiatives that we had listed previously on Ken's slide. And we've actually already broken those apart in the current year financials. We are breaking those into those categories already. So we've been, you know, working towards this process throughout the year. So next slide. Just a recap on the project listings that you have, and just to reiterate, if anybody is new to looking at these lists, you'll notice are in two sections. One of them will indicate it's capital projects. So those are the projects that we deem that we actually will capitalize what's going on in those projects. And the other ones are projects or requirements. And following accounting guidelines, these are things that are not able to be capitalized, but fall within our capital and project budget scenario. So there are some, if you looked at last year's, you'll notice that we actually closed, from a dollar standpoint, a lot more projects than we did the prior year. We about doubled the amount, but we had some pretty large projects that completed. Our bar FRP project, some EMS enhancements, and are both a hybrid 2A and 2B projects, which were large projects, budget projects. So that accounts for a lot of the increase in our recap here. So the active projects for this year, they actually have come down, and we're always glad to see that we don't have to try and continue as many projects. Last year we had about 35 capital projects that were still on board at that point, so we have been able to close those and are in the completed list. Look here. As far as we do still have a fairly large budget amount of projects, the biggest piece of that is our settlements project, which is a very large project that we did go to the board to get special funding to continue on with that one. And the CRR project and another hybrid project are very large projects in that existing budget. It's really all I have here, unless there's some questions on any of the items.
Questions at this time?
Okay, I'll turn it over to Dennis Estrada.
Hi, this is Dennis Estrada of the accounting group. And before I go through my financial summary, I'd like to remind everybody in the call that the audited financial statements and the results of our operations through the second quarter of 2023 are available on our website, caiso.com, under About Us and Publications and Financials. Next slide, please. So for 2022, the key highlights are our operating revenues were higher by $6.2 million compared to budget, and this was driven primarily due to our higher GMC collections of $3.2 million, despite us having to adjust the rates twice in 2022. And in addition, our miscellaneous revenues were higher by about $3 million. And this was primarily driven by higher than expected income from forecasting, generator interconnection projects, and meter subsystems. Operating expense likewise was lower by about $5.7 million. And this was primarily driven by lower spends for salaries and wages, which contributed about $5.1 million due to a lower average headcount during the year than we would have liked or anticipated. In addition, lower legal and audit, lower training, and other expenses were down. And this, I think, is a reflection of our continued discipline in upholding and ensuring fiscal responsibility in our spending. Other income from investments, we had losses in our investments, and this was driven primarily by huge unrealized losses in our portfolio due to higher interest rates, which we experienced during the end of 2022. Next slide, please. Operating revenues through June. It was higher slightly by about $600,000, and this was driven primarily by higher GMC of 1.2, but was offset by lower other revenues of $600,000. Next slide, please. GMC revenues are still higher by $1.2 million through June, despite the colder temperatures than normal in May and June. And next slide, please. Operating and maintenance expenses is running lower than budget by about $6.7 million, and again, is primarily driven by lower headcount. We currently have through June, we had about 66 open positions we are trying to fill, and so to date, it has contributed for the lower spend in that area. Other areas were also lower, such as training and audit costs, but these are primarily driven by timing because we budget most of these items on a straight line basis, but the spending is normally not on that basis either. Next slide. Capital expenditures. As Jan has mentioned, we have budgeted $25 million to date, and through June, we have an approved projects of around $16.8 million. And the associated cost for those projects that have been approved is about $2.5 million today. So that's the end of my presentation, and if there's any question, I'm going to turn it over to Thomas.
Thank you, Dennis. I'll now walk us through the calendar and the next steps. Next slide, please. To allow for continued involvement for all stakeholders, I'll go through the upcoming key calendar dates shown below. Please note that if any of these dates change, the changes will be communicated and posted on our stakeholder webpage. Our internal development process is underway right now and continues through October. Based on the information presented in this meeting today, we welcome your comments via the stakeholder comment tool, which are due by August 15th. The ISO will post our responses to those comments by August 22nd, and the comments will be considered during the internal development process. Once our internal process is complete, we will post the preliminary draft revenue requirement by October 27th, and then present the draft of the revenue requirement at the next stakeholder call on October 31st. At this next meeting, you will have another opportunity to provide us comments by November 7th. This will ensure that we can respond to your comments before the revenue requirement is submitted for final approval during the board meeting on December 12th through the 13th. We will present the preliminary draft revenue requirement at the Board of Governors meeting executive session on November 8th. We will then submit the draft revenue requirement for approval at the Board of Governors meeting general session on December 12th through the 13th. At the general session, board of Governor's meeting, there is one last opportunity to provide public comments to the board on the final draft revenue requirement. The ISO will then request approval of this final draft, and assuming approval, once the revenue requirement is approved, these rates would then be posted by December 19th. I'll now hand this back over to the host of today's call. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. We do have a question in queue. Paul Nelson from Customized Energy Solutions, please go ahead.
Hi, yes, just a quick sound check that you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So I don't see in the schedule approval for FERC for the new rate. So I'm assuming that if the request is less than the cap, like you said, it's 202 million, then FERC approval is not required. Is my understanding correct?
Yes, our current revenue requirement cap is through 2024. With the cost of service study initiative, we are proposing to change the revenue requirement cap in 2025 and in 2026.
Okay. But for 2024, the 202 million cap still applies, but then I guess next year you're going to look to apply for an adjustment to the cap?
Correct.
Okay.
This is Bill Weaver from Legal. I'll say it's actually this year that we'll seek approval to change the cap for the year starting in 2025. And otherwise, the tariff will lay out this year how it's going to change each year as it goes up.
Oh, okay. So you'll at some point in another proceeding or initiative, you'll make the filing this year for a cost cap increase for 2025 and beyond.
Correct.
Yeah,
okay.
Paul, that's part of the cost of service study proceeding that's going on right now. So that'll be filed with FERC later this year. And as Bill said, it won't take effect, the cap increase, until 2025.
Okay. And when do you think that filing might occur at FERC?
We'll file it in October with the,
okay.
And we expect to have an answer going into before the board meeting in December.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right, thanks everyone for that. I think at this time, I don't see any other further questions in queue. Michelle, do we have any audio questions?
There are currently no audio questions in queue.
Great. On our next steps for this specific process, we are also, to add on what Thomas said, we are accepting comments that are due by the August 15th in the commenting tool that's located on this specific process website. I did provide that link on the chat if you want to go ahead and take a head start on reviewing those documents that were mentioned throughout this presentation, as well any other questions. Feel free to route those over to ISO Stakeholder Affairs at CAISO.com. And if there's any questions on the commenting tool, let us know. We'll make sure to answer those, but that's ready. The next slide presents to everyone an energy blog that's provided by the California ISO. Just to keep everyone informed, we are currently featuring the July blog about the big steps towards transmission infrastructure with our director, Debbie Levine, who talks about many of those goals that they're having in her department. So it's really great if you're able to check that out on our energy blog. We post about once a month. And last month we did post on energy storage milestone of hitting 5,000 megawatts. So it's a great place to kind of catch up on the news. And lastly, part of the Stakeholder Affairs group, the California ISO will be co-hosting along with Bank, NV Energy, Pacific Corp, and Southern California Edison for the Extended Day Ahead Market Forum that will be held at Las Vegas Hilton at Resorts World on August 30th from 8:30 to 4:30. We will be hosting a welcome event on the 29th, and that information to register it's already sent out a notice from last week. There's additional information and a website linked here on this slide that you can feel free to visit for more information, but we look forward to other stakeholders who are interested in participating, who have been participating with Extended Day Ahead Market, and, you know, be able to discuss with other stakeholders that will be there in person. So please go ahead and check that out. But other than that, I think for my updates we have, this is the last slide, but if there's any other questions, I'll wait for 1 minute for those who want to raise their hand using the raise hand icon below in your chat window. And if you can, take the opportunity to do that now. Thank you.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.